Hello, I'm Jim Turk, and I'd like to welcome you to today's panel session that's being sponsored by the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson. The title is "How Do You Know That?" When journalists' best questions seem too sensitive to ask. I want to begin the session by acknowledging that the territory in which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We have quite a remarkable panel for you today, and this event is being co-sponsored by the Canadian Association of Journalists and the Ryerson Journalism Research Center, and I would like to thank them both for their co-sponsorship. Our panelists are quite experienced, interesting journalists, and I'd like to introduce them. The first is Shenaz Kermalli. Shenaz is a freelance writer specializing in geopolitics. She's a former producer with BBC News Online, CBC News, and Al Jazeera English. She teaches Journalism 103 at Ryerson. She also teaches at the University of Toronto and at Humber College. Shenaz has written for the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Ottawa Citizen, Responsible Statecraft, iPolitics, TVO, Global News, and The Guardian, amongst others. Welcome, Shenaz.
Thanks, Jim.
Our second panelist is Vinnie Akari. Vidya is a graduate of the School of Journalism at Ryerson, and she began shortly thereafter working at Law 360, which is a subscription-based legal news service operated by Portfolio Media Company, which is a subsidiary of LexisNexis. She started there as a general assignment reporter and then became a senior reporter and now is deputy managing editor. Welcome, Vidya. Our third panelist is Adrian Ma. Adrian is an award-winning journalist, a multimedia producer, an author, and assistant professor of journalism at Ryerson, where he teaches digital news reporting, personal branding, and 360 VR storytelling. He worked for numerous Canadian news outlets, including the CBC and the Toronto Star. Adrian has also written a book about the Chinese-Canadian history titled How the Chinese Created Canada. Welcome, Adrian.
Jim, good to see you, man.
And the moderator for this impressive group of panelists is quite impressive herself. It's Janice Neal. Janice is a journalist and an academic, having taught journalism at Carleton and since 2007 in the School of Journalism at Ryerson, where she teaches podcasting, broadcast news, and professional practices. She served as departmental chair in the School of Journalism from 2016 to 2021. Her journalism career includes being senior producer of CBC Radio 1's Metro Morning in Toronto. So I guess you got used to early mornings, Janice. Also TV Ontario Studio 2 in Ottawa. A reporter, she served as a reporter for CBC in London in the UK, in Toronto and in Regina, and has served as editor-in-chief of jsource.ca. She's also an active board member of J Schools Canada and of the National News Media Council. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you, Jim.
Now the format,
Thank you, Jim.
the format for today's event is Janice and the panel are going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes or so, anyways, 45 to 50 minutes or thereabouts. And after which there'll be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And at any point a question comes to mind that you would like to ask the panel, simply click on Q&A and write out your question. Don't wait till Janice turns to the audience for questions to do so. Just do it as you're listening, as the question comes to mind, and the panel will get to the questions in due course. I think that's all for now, so over to you, Janice.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome to the panelists today. You know, when I was a journalism student, one of my professors worked for CBS, and he had worked for 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes was a blockbuster investigative show that was on, TV show that was on every Sunday night. Got bumped for football games, I think, but it was on, and one of their stars was a journalist named Mike Wallace. Mike Wallace developed a very distinctive style. He was really aggressive in his questioning. He was bruising and asked, closed-ended questions, real zingers, like, did you murder your wife? Often guests would kind of come away of feeling they survived or not, and they called the experience of being interviewed by him Mike Fright. So it was all very good theater. But, as a journalism student, as a young journalist, this was held up, certainly to me. And I think to an awful lot of North Americans who were viewing this, as well as other journalists, as a model for how to be a successful interviewer. So I want to start off with asking you, from what I've described, if Mike Wallace, who died about 10 years ago, I think, is not familiar to you, but that style, how does that model, that approach to interviewing resonate with you? Adrian.
Good to see you, Janice. How are you? That's a great, thank you for painting that picture in my mind. And because I do come from a bit of a broadcast multimedia background, that does resonate with me. I just remember having this distinct memory when I was, kind of coming up in the business. And one of my first kind of training experiences in a newsroom, I was learning about radio reporting. I was paired up with a more experienced radio reporter. And I worked on a pre-interview and a green. I was with a subject that was talking about a family loss that was very close to her. We did the pre-interview, did the background research, and then we went over the questions. And then I remember distinctly, she looked at me and said, I think we can make her cry on air. Being, maybe it's not like a written rule, but I do gather that when you're trying to tell stories, using audio and video especially, those sort of emotional moments that you see people express, they can be very compelling. And I think it's a kind of intuitive thing that we sometimes have is oh, like that's a great moment. It's you use the word theater. It's a very kind of theatrical moment, I think, when we sort of do ask a question that elicits that sort of response. And so that your question to me, it does resonate with me, because I do feel like part of my experience coming up in the industry, that sort of storytelling was kind of emphasized, like the idea that you try and go for the emotion, you try and really bring out that human drama.
All right, thank you. Shenaz?
Yeah, thanks, Janice. Yeah, it resonates with me too, albeit in a little bit of a different way. I went to journalism school in the UK, and the anchor there that was sort of held up as a kind of like, that was held up on a bit of a pedestal in terms of interviewing style was a BBC anchor named Jeremy Paxman. And he was very, very well known for taking that same kind of very aggressive, adversarial type of approach. And I remember not knowing at all who he was when it was mentioned in journalism lectures, and then quickly, checking, BBC News clips to see who he was, and being absolutely shocked to see that this was what was considered to be a great interviewing style or great journalism, essentially. And I think, just kind of being like that kind of image of a journalist and interviewer really kind of stirred me to look to study media criticism. I think in my dissertation in university, where I looked specifically at media coverage of Muslims and Islam in some British newspapers, and that's when it really kind of hit me that there's this other side to journalism where we really need to understand the implications of interviewing people in that kind of way, right? There are gross implications, and there's a sense of responsibility and humility that comes with doing this job that I think in some ways was just not really conveyed to me when I was in the journalism program that I was in there.
Okay, thank you. And we'll return to that in a moment. Vidya, I know your career has been not in theater. Your interviewing has not been in front of millions of viewers or listeners. But still, that I think, you know, there are lots of other models of interviewers whose work perhaps wasn't so visible that had that style. Did it resonate for you? How did that resonate with you?
Definitely. I think that's so interesting that, I wonder in Adrian's story if the producer was trying to get the source to cry or if it evolved more organically. I certainly don't want to discount the the value of emotions, and for myself as somebody who's mostly written for print and online publications, those emotions are, those sort of theatrical moments are, I realize how essential they can be in the broadcast world, but they're just as important in being able to describe, those feelings in stories. We want to be able to get at the heart of a story. We want to see people's raw feelings on any particular topic. I think where all of this gives me pause now is, we do live in such a polarized world right now, and we have been for a number of years, where trust in journalists has eroded, and we talk about that often. We see many media stories about it, and it's such a divisive world. It may have started, around the time Trump first got elected to be the U.S. president, and now we have, with COVID, very strong feelings about whether everybody should be vaccinated or not. And I worry that sort of very aggressive reporting, where we speak more to, we sort of expect people to be reasonable and answer our questions objectively and openly. I think maybe that could have the effect of dividing people more and shutting people down and not revealing the full story. And I'd be more interested in a sort of solutions-focused style of journalism where we talk about, where we really explore not only the position that people have, but how they came to form that position, and even let them know that an interview style where we're not just listening actively to these sources, but letting them know that we are listening with pointed questions that let them know that we actually care about their side of the story, even if we may not agree with it. And to perhaps change the demeanor that I was, or the performance that I was alluding to, and that you were alluding to as well. Shenaz, you said, after watching Jeremy Patzman, you did reflect on this in a critical way and looked at for many different ways. What would you say? What would perhaps are some of the values that inform the way that you approach interviews since that time?
Since that time, yeah, I have been reflecting on that question. I mean, I've reflected on that question in the past because I've seen the way, I've observed just within myself how I carry out interviews now compared to how I did earlier in my career, and there's a world of difference. I think two of the things that inform my values now that I always think deeply about before I start interviewing someone is consent. Like it's not just, do you consent to doing this interview with me, or are you okay to do this interview, but really making sure that my sources are very comfortable with being on the record, like knowing exactly what that means, with the information that they're sharing with me, and also like making sure that they understand what which publication I write for, because I'm a freelancer, and so I can write for different publications. I do write for different publications, and so I don't, and sometimes I'm writing on spec, right, which can be disconcerting for some sources. They want to know definitively where their words are going to end up. So I've learned through mistakes I've made, of course, that it's very important to be very transparent about what my intentions are, where their words will be, where they'll be published, if they'll be published or not, what sometimes what the news gathering process entails, because there's there not enough people out there really have a strong sense of media literacy, and so sometimes my job is like part of my role is I feel to educate them on that. I don't feel like we are very transparent sometimes in our processes, right? And in the way newsrooms operate and what editors are looking for. So I'd say informed consent is definitely something that I hold.
So can I just jump in there a little bit about informed consent and break it down? And I think at the at the surface level, you put a microphone, you have a camera, you stand there with a notebook, whatever, you phone someone if they agree to agree to the interview, that is consent at the the surface level. I think what you're talking about goes a little bit deeper. Adrian, do you want to talk break down maybe some of the factors that are involved in informed consent that I'm going to suggest again maybe haven't always been there in journalism, that are part of a much more of an emerging approach?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And it just kind of reminds me, like, as I've transitioned from the newsroom into an academic environment, it's quite interesting. I mean, interviewing is such a huge part of journalism. It is also a huge part of any kind of academic research. And with academia, you have like an that you have to get approvals from, because it is designed to help minimize harm to participants. And so, journalism as professional practice, we largely avoid, having those approvals because it's not practical. And also there is a sense that, we need to move swiftly. There are just certain things about being independent and having to get those approvals. But I think informed consent exists too with people that are possibly in very vulnerable positions. And I think one of the key things that we see from research ethics is to really allow people the opportunity to stop their participation if things are, getting really, really, really heavy for them. Like if, I think there's plenty of research to suggest that when people have experienced traumatic events and suffer from PTSD, having them retell that story makes them relive it in some ways. And so just being very conscious of that, and knowing that people are putting themselves through real sort of emotional and even sometimes physical distress to do so should be at the top of our minds in consideration.
Vidya, what does informed consent look like to you?
So, I like that Adrian brought up the idea of talking to vulnerable sources who perhaps have PTSD. I think that's such a great example, because to answer this question, I actually have to go back and for myself and break it down to, well, what is a sensitive question? Is it something that we are afraid to ask? Is it something that's going to elicit a strong emotion from somebody else? And does it change depending on the context? So are we talking to trauma survivors or crime victims? Or are we talking to people involved in, say, union disputes, labor disputes, which can also get very charged and very politicized? So I think that, informed consent changes in all of these settings, but especially when dealing with, say, trauma survivors, or say, for example, covering a sexual harassment case. We really want to, in my view, if it's sexual harassment, let the source know that, if they request anonymity, to grant that, and that doesn't really apply in all cases. But I think that's a special case where I think it makes sense to wield control until they are ready to be publicly named and attached to these stories, just because they have so much to lose from coming forward with their stories. And when interviewing sources also, let them know ahead of time that, ask them if they have a preference, if you're going to record a conversation or take notes, and if it's necessary to record. That may not be something they're comfortable with. Maybe nobody's recorded their voices before. So perhaps explain to them that the reason for doing that is to make sure that you get your facts correctly and you can go back and check after, rather than having them recount their story over and over again. Choose an interview setting that they are comfortable with. Before going into the interview, I agree with everything Shenaz said. Tell them who you are, where you work for, that you plan to publish the story, and especially for student journalists or freelancers, they may not have a specific idea of where to publish, but tell them you plan to publish, you just don't know when, and it could be online or on a blog, and sources deserve to know that ahead of time, and at the start of the interview too. I think it helps to have a general conversation before diving into the hard questions about the topic, just so it gives them, all of these things give them time to emotionally prepare and feel more comfortable in sharing their story with you.
I mean, so much of the preparation that you're talking about and the care that you're talking about, it sounds like you are really on the side of the interview, on the interview subject. That's probably not what is in a lot of people's minds when they're thinking about the journalist and the source, interview subject relationship, that they are like this, as opposed to kind of beside each other. How do you, Shenaz, how do you see if I'm going like this, and from what Vidya and Adrian described, being kind of on the side and having this care, how do you see that relationship changing?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's tension, right? It's kind of like a necessary tension. I see it as a tension because you know that you are supposed to be completely neutral. But at the same time, you know how important it is to be empathetic to your sources, I think, right? In order to be able to elicit the best information from them, the most relevant, compelling information from them as you can. And so I think it helps to acknowledge, that if they're going to share something with you that is traumatic or painful or difficult, to acknowledge that with your source. But I don't know. I mean, when I think back to when I felt this sort of tension most, it was probably when I was when I had an exclusive interview with the wife of the ringleader of the July 7th terrorist attacks in London. Now you can just imagine how difficult it was for her to speak to me, to agree to speak to me in that interview. She was persuaded into doing it. She didn't really want to do it. But I also had to be very, very careful to keep my emotions at bay, because those attacks where, they took place in London, where I lived, they literally took place, like the suicide bombings took place minutes from where I lived. I was literally walking towards the tube station when one of them blew off. And then 2 weeks later, I was on the doorstep of her house wanting to know how much she knew about what her husband had done, and so, and I was infuriated, right, as a Muslim, that first of all, that this had happened in London, like very close to where I was living, and two, like that there were Muslims who were doing this and invoking it in the name of the religion that we share, so I was very conflicted at that time, and so I approached the interview in kind of the way we're talking about. I did kind of express to her that I told her that I lived very close to, King's Cross Station, where it had happened. But I also said, I recognize that this is really, really difficult. This must be really difficult for you. And you might not have wanted to do this, but it's really, I tried to kind of, I tried to tell her that, this is your opportunity to tell the public what you're going through right now, right? And so this is, and if there's someone that you can kind of trust to share that side of the story, consider me kind of thing, but I really, it was a difficult time. And I really,
Shenaz,
had to think about
sorry.
it afterwards. Yeah.
Shenaz, how did you arrive at that position as opposed to the position that I'm sure it was on the minds of many people of going in and speaking as a spouse and being? Why did you feel that you? I don't necessarily want to talk about the particular, the story, but generally, why was that your impulse to approach this interview, as you said, with empathy, as opposed to being tough and
Oh,
how
right.
could you not have known what your husband was doing, or
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not sure I was very successful in really holding back that tone. Like, I'm not sure. I think that tone might have come across now. I don't really remember. It was such a long time ago, but I know that I had to talk to my editor and like for a long time beforehand, and I decided he asked me several times, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And I said, "Absolutely," because I want to know, what really motivated this person to do these actions, and it's almost like I felt stirred, like I was very determined to find out what the motivation was, and I wasn't trying to rationalize it, and I had to be careful to not come across like I was doing that, but I knew, I think what was at stake, like I really wanted this exclusive interview with her. No British media had spoken to this family before I had, so it was definitely a scoop, but I knew I had to treat it with a lot of care, and I had to, show her the respect that that she needed to feel like she had in order to share her experiences with me, in the most honest way.
I thank you. I can see that I know that there would be, concerns that this might be, diluting the reporting. That's, I'll put air quotes or people saying that, and that this, approach. How do you guard against, misshaping the story, Adrian? How do you not see, for the example that Shenaz gave, for instance, as perhaps compromising what you think a journalist should be doing?
That's probably one of the toughest questions we're trying to tackle here, right? And I'm not sure exactly what the metric is, what the answer is. Here's what I generally advise with my students. It's what I've been exploring with them, which is I think power dynamics really is an important aspect of this. Who has the power in this relationship? So, when you interview a politician who presumably has had media training, who has more experience with the media, who is an elected official whose job it is to be accountable to the public. Would I sort of, back off of them a little bit in that respect? Probably not nearly as much as the person with zero media training, who is just gone through one of the most vulnerable and difficult experiences of their life. Of course, I think I'm gonna give them much more consideration over how I'm going to approach this interview, because they might not fully understand the consequences of what they're going to say. It's just that extra layer of care. I think we have a responsibility as reporters to those people in those situations. And so it's a hard question to answer, but I think that it's not something that we should shy away from, because as journalists, we have this professional experience, this professional training. I think it's part of our jobs to recognize when those situations deserve kind of more of our consideration in terms of the duty of care we have for a source, versus another time when maybe it is our jobs to push a little bit more, to hold people accountable. And there are times that we don't. And I think that's part of our job, is to really recognize those situations and understand them, when to do so and when not to.
Yeah, I can just add to that. I think that's a great point. I think we have to, in journalism school, we learn to exercise and develop our news judgment, right? That's what it is. And you do that through your career too. And you become better and better at it as the more you do it.
Vidya, have you had situations where you've had to do maybe a bit more of a negotiation or navigating with yourself in terms of these areas?
I'm trying to think of an example, but, first I wanted to say I love that you use the word care. I think in journalism, we talk so much about transparency, we talk about objectivity, we talk about our conflicts of interest, and these are all things we're so mindful of all the time, and check the spellings of our sources' names, and, we have the fundamentals, and we just don't talk about care quite as much. In Shenaz's example, and Shenaz, like, really great job getting that exclusive interview. And, I recognize that was a difficult situation for both you and your source. You talked about how you sort of, you're not sure, or you don't think that you reined in that part of you that was sort of incredulous, and like, did you not know your husband was doing this? And for all we know, the wife was probably asking the exact same question. How did I not know all of this was going on? We don't know. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't, but I think we have to give her the benefit of that doubt. So I'm not sure we necessarily need to rein in that sort of tone, or as you said, Shenaz, or sentiment that may come across as judgmental. I think what's really important is throughout the interview, before and throughout the interview, and even, there's a concept of aftercare as well in journalism, letting the source know that you're the only one with their story. Nobody owes you their story. And so when that story is given to you, when it's shared with you, we have such a responsibility to treat it with care and to treat it with responsibility and portray it accurately. To that extent, I find this practice of looping really helpful, going back to the source and saying, just during the interview when they say something, checking back with them and saying, so as I understand it, you were frustrated or furious that this happened. And they may come back to you and say, no, I wasn't frustrated, I was livid. And there's that nuance that's so important to, to distinguish. And that's another thing that really lets the source know that you're actually listening and really interested in their story. So thank you for that example, Shenaz.
I think a couple of, Adrian mentioned trauma, you mentioned care, and I think kind of generally what you're describing is a move towards what's called trauma-informed reporting, which is very, very new. There is the first major survey about Canadian journalists about trauma and learning about trauma-informed care. It just came out of the field a few months ago by a couple of other colleagues, and although there's a place called the DART Center, which is about trauma. I also that has been around for probably a couple decades. It's still very, very new for a lot of journalists. A researcher in the UK he works at the BBC, and he surveyed some of his colleagues, and he found over 80% of them had never really engaged in learning about trauma-informed reporting, to say kind of nothing of their, own care. So it's really interesting that that we are engaging with it and you're talking about it here as if it is part of the daily practice. And I'm just wondering if there is pushback against that. Are there challenges sometimes from other people or even within the story to those approaches?
Sorry, Janice, can you clarify your question? I'm not sure I followed it.
A movement towards trauma-informed reporting. Is there pushback against it from editors, from organizations, from the public who think that perhaps journalists should be maybe a little bit more head-on?
I would say so. I think this conflict we have here is news is so rapid. Like we have quick, hard, fast deadlines, and we have to work really fast to get that story out there. And regardless of whether it's print or online or broadcast, we're always limited for space. And I think that's where the challenge comes in. Can you get a nuanced story? Can you build trust with your sources in that limited time and the limited space? And that's where sometimes there's a pushback, and we can't write, like a 2-page newspaper story on one person's trauma as much as we would like to. That's just not realistic in this industry. But so I think we have to be creative and think about, well, what can we do? How can we approach the story? Are there parts of the story that we can narrate, say, in graphs or graphical tools? But that's definitely a place where there's pushback and conflict.
Yeah, I'd agree, especially in daily newsrooms, right? Where, it's completely dictated by the daily news cycle. I mean, it's just, news is so fast, it's so fluid. You have to be able to react instantly in real time. And I feel like if there were some daily news reporters that were listening to this, their first instinct might be like, well, I don't have the time, and they're right. I mean, you have to work under very rigorous deadlines. But this is why I kind of put so much, I stress this point so much with my students in class, because I tell them that, I'm giving you the opportunity while you're in journalism school to develop this type of mindset, right? And this type of approach to your research, so that when you are out there working in industry, you're able to implement, like, these are not going to be new ideas to you. You're going to be able to implement them more quickly and, move more quickly on your feet than people who have not kind of been brought up to speed with these new approaches to journalism, but in a more practical sense, I've always felt that one thing that editorial leaders could be doing in newsrooms is to consider giving daily news reporters a 4-day week, like a day off or an afternoon off, to literally just for research purposes, to be able to do more in-depth analysis and research on stories that are more long-term for them, or just to kind of give them the time to delve into communities, to get to know them better and to develop more trusting relationships with them, so that you're not always like parachuting in and out of stories and communities that you're interested in reporting on, but you're really kind of approaching them with more more meaningfully.
Adrian, thank you. Adrian, you mentioned earlier, you talked about the power that journalists have in the situation. We talked about the settings and the questions and all the rest of it. What could potential interview subjects do to have agency over their participation in the process?
Thanks for the question, and I apologize. My internet's been kind of cutting in and out over the last 20 minutes, so if I drop out again, thank you very much. I wasn't bored, I swear. That is an excellent question, and I feel like it's just so interesting because instinctively, I feel a lot of journalists, the idea of giving kind of any editorial agency to a source is just, it feels problematic and taken to large levels. It absolutely is. I think there are some ways in which we can be a bit more collaborative in how we work with sources and how we interview them, as opposed to extractive, as opposed to the idea that we're just mining people for their stories and their traumas so that we can, have this interesting story to tell. One idea which I really loved, and it's from my colleague Karen Pugliese, whom I'm sure many of you know, which is the idea that if someone is having if they know they're going to be having a really difficult conversation and reliving something really traumatic and sensitive, is to give them the opportunity to access their own self-care. So I think a technique that she has used before is, if there's someone that you trust, like someone that you feel safe with, she allows them to bring them to the interview and just kind of be in the room or even sit beside them, hold their hand. They're not a part of the interview, but it's the idea that, we're already kind of putting you in this position to have to relive this, but, to have someone there for you is, I think, a very powerful way to build a bit of trust and to let them know that, we really appreciate the fact that you're kind of, sharing the story with us, and however ways we can kind of minimize the hurt that comes with that is something that I think is helpful. I know that some approaches, Vidya, you mentioned this before too, but sometimes reading back quotes or things that the source has said to you to try and, let them know what the proper context is and how you're using the material, I think, is important. And that's something that a lot of magazine fact checkers do anyways, right? Like, you just want to clarify, this is what you meant when you said this. Just to kind of, be a bit more transparent about the news gathering process, and to give them the opportunity to clarify something, especially that may have been said in the moment when they may have been in a very vulnerable state, when they were very upset. There could have been, these extenuating circumstances that we're not sure of during the interview. I think those are some ways in which we can offer the source some agency. And something else that I just kind of think of is, how you frame stories is just so important in that respect too. A story about trauma and hurt and pain can be a story about victimhood and hopelessness, and it often is. But it also could be a story about resilience, and it could be a story about overcoming obstacles, and as Vidya mentioned before, like, a solution to something. And I feel like, if the source, if that angle is there, the reporter can make a decision to frame the story in a different way. And maybe that's one way in which we try and address this balance of, we're always focusing so much on the tension and the misery. Well, if there are opportunities to kind of focus on, some of the more hopeful moments that come out of trauma, then I think we should take them.
So what if, so you as a journalist have decided to frame a story as one of victimhood, and that's not the way that the person who's being interviewed sees it? How do you navigate that? What is your job as is it not your job as a journalist to decide what the framing of a story is, whatever the other person thinks?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. It's basically, do you somehow see this person defined in a way that they don't define themselves? I think that's interesting, right? Like, do they themselves see do they see themselves as a victim? Or do they see themselves as someone who has survived something? And I think we have to kind of respect, like, that perspective, that we are just looking at this from one angle, but it's really their story that we are sharing. And if I think they're, actually, Vidya and Shenaz, I'm so interested in what your response would be too, because I think it's such a fascinating question.
Yeah, I think power and the use of that word power is, as humans, I think we all have this natural tendency to, when we have power, we want to hold on to it. We're unwilling to give it up. I think we've just we've seen that time and time again with so many important figures. So I think I may have a slightly different relationship with power, where I think yielding control, or perhaps, Adrian, I think what you meant by collaborating, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're using that in the same way, those two terms in the same way. I think yielding control, some control to sources, doesn't take away power for us. We're still the people writing the story. We're still the people telling the story on TV or on radio. The power imbalance stays. And I think what happens instead when we collaborate or yield control to our sources a little bit is they actually become more empowered, which allows us to tell the story more authoritatively. So, I think just I see no harm in giving a source, allowing a source to make an informed consent, or giving them the information they need, letting them know that they can trust you to treat their story responsibly, to understand what they're actually trying to tell you. I think those are vital, really crucial things to do in an interview. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%. What it reminds me of, this part of the conversation reminds me of the recent New York Times story that dropped, that has been getting a lot of criticism by Canadian journalists, right, about the truckers convoy. Because Adrian, when you brought up framing, it's all about that, right? The way that Catherine Porter, I believe, framed the story around the truckers convoy. A lot of people said that she was, she played on stereotypes about Canadians. She framed the convoy as something that was foreign funded, and US inspired. There were factual errors in her reporting. And what all the criticism, it spoke to me in a way that made me think, like, here is Canada, a US ally, right? They're both English speaking countries. But and here is a reporter from a leading US newspaper covering a Canadian story, but doing it in a way that infuriates a lot of Canadians, because they don't really like their story being told by somebody else, or the way that it's been done has been problematic on some level. And so it goes back to, Adrian, what you're saying about how we need to be more mindful about story sharing instead of storytelling, and kind of lending the power to more power to our sources. And so again, to kind of highlight the dynamic again between Canada and the US, it reminds me of all this sort of challenges I've had when reporting on the Middle East with my sources there, who just don't want to talk to me because I am a reporter with a Western news outlet, because the level of mistrust towards Western news outlets is so, there literally is no trust towards them, because of how poorly Western media is in framing stories that come from, stories that are set in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Saudi, and so forth,
One of my favorite writers, you may know of her, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and a quote somewhat loosely from her that I really like is that the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, it's that they are incomplete. And I think that's important. I think we can take a lesson from that quote. We all have confirmation biases. We go in with our own opinions or idea of what a story can be or what a story should be. And we need to guard against that when going into interviews and think about, well, what are we missing here when talking to a particular source? We have this idea of them. Are they going to fulfill our narrative that our editor asked for? Or is there a nuance that could make for a more complete story?
Exactly. That kind of implicit bias and cognitive bias training, I think, is actually really important to include in journalism curriculum. When you're teaching about interviewing, teach them about implicit bias, and confirmation bias, all the different biases that exist out there, because that is something that you need to know when you're approaching strangers and asking them to share their stories with you. And yet I didn't learn any of that where I went to school, and I know that's just not part of really journalism curriculum, but it's great to have conversations like this, because then that the dial is moving, right? Like, things are changing, and it really kind of gives me, anyway, hope for the future, for future generations of storytellers.
Well, and there's no doubt. You mentioned the declining trust in the media as perhaps one of the pushes against changing the way journalism. But I think just as importantly and integrated is how much more diverse our newsrooms have become, how much more they should become to represent the communities to look and feel like the communities that they represent. And and that doesn't, and that goes deep. That means understanding the circumstances, situations, and so when you and the cultural context, so that when you go into interviews, you aren't just going in to pull out the details that you think are there to fill your story. It's not a fill in. It's not a fill in the blank, right? Yeah. Adrian, you're nodding your head.
I am nodding my head. I mean, this is just completely anecdotal to me, but I know all of you have, taught at journalism school institutions recently. I think the students that are coming in are more diverse than I've ever seen before, especially in urban-based J schools. And in my experience, it's a lot of my own students that are pushing this forward. That a lot of them come from marginalized communities where there is a heavy distrust of media because of how they've been treated as sources in the past, about how certain narratives have never really merited, a fuller picture, any follow-up. They're really kind of wary of parachute journalism. And so it's really fascinating. Like I have a lot of hope and optimism too, because they're the ones coming in actively wanting to change this aspect of the industry. And I couldn't be more supportive of it. I just think it's just a reflection of our society and how we are changing.
We started the discussion. We talked when Adrian, you mentioned how you were booking a guest that was expected to cry, and I think so much of what we talked about is playing on those emotions and not to manipulate them, but to build a relationship that is with your interview subject that includes an emotional layer. Is there a problem with that? Does that come at a cost?
I think about this a lot, actually, and I don't think any of us doubt the importance and how compelling emotion is. Like, that's why we inject it into our stories. That's why we search for it. We try and really unearth it. Ultimately, I keep thinking back to this. It is the source that bears all the cost of that. They get their stories, pushed into the world, their vulnerabilities for everyone to see. And in a perfect world, their story makes a difference and they can feel good that I think they've contributed to shedding light on perhaps like a really important issue. But, like as journalists, we bear so little risk when it comes to that relationship. Like, we write the stories, we do our best to do the due diligence, but we are very protected for those of us who are employed or, part of newsrooms. If we make a mistake, it's something that we learn from and try to move on from. But, if these people are represented, these stories can come to define them for so many years. That's what they become known for, in the public. So I think, I wouldn't advise people necessarily to shy away from connecting with people emotionally and capturing that emotion, but it has to be earned. It can't just be taken from someone. It can't just be mined from someone. It has to be earned, and you do that in a natural way. You build by building trust and transparency, and I think a recurring theme, offering that standard of care that we really should to have for them. And I think in that way, I think we can work with that.
Yeah, if you quote another person, there's a social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, and I don't know if you're familiar with this quote, but he says, anybody who values truth should stop worshiping reason. And that resonates with me because people are unreasonable. And that's not to discredit or devalue people, but emotions really control the way we move through the world, the way we interact with everybody. And that's why I think we really need to understand why our sources feed a particular way, and let them know. I feel like a parrot now. I've said this before. Let them know that we're listening, because that's the thing that's really going to build trust and encourage them, empower them to tell you their story to the fullest that they're comfortable doing so.
I'm going to ask my last question to each of you, and I want to know when you feel that you have done a really good job as an interviewer. What have you done, and what have you produced? Shenaz?
I think what comes to mind most immediately is when I've done an interview and I've come out of it, I feel like it was a success if I learned something new. Like if I see the immediate kind of newsworthiness of something that was said to me, that gets me really excited. And I mean, I see it as an indication that I'm on the right track. I've identified the right angle. This is going to be amazing. It's going to get a lot of traction. I love being the first to learn about something new. I want to be the first to put that information out there, whether it's a perspective or something that someone witnessed themselves. I want to be the person who's conveying it to the public. And I guess what comes with that is a confidence that I'm the best person to do that, to write that story, and to transmit that information to the world. So yeah, that's kind of what that's kind of the indicator for me that I've had a great interview.
All right. Vidya.
This is a really tough question. Part of it's, involving boosting my own ego, which I don't always do. And I like what Shenaz said, and I want to steal your answer, Shenaz. I also really love it when I'm the first to learn something, and that is the sign of a really good interview. I think also in speaking to a source, have I also walked away with a sense that they have been as truthful as they can be? Do I have other sources to collaborate their information with? I think that's really important to know. Do they come back and thank me for my time? They don't have to do that at all. Sometimes they have, and when sources do take the time to do that, depending on who it is, I know that they either really want me to tell their story for their own political advantage, or they're really grateful for somebody listening and taking the time to tell their story to the world, because that's ultimately what they want to do. They want to share their story. They want to share their feelings. They want people to understand where they're coming from. And I think, if I always try to ask them too in an interview, is there anything else that I haven't asked you that you really want to share? I think that asking that question often elicits such strong responses, and that usually gives me the feeling of, okay, now my interview is solid.
Good stuff. All right, we're coming to you, Adrian. And then when I said a couple of minutes ago that bringing to this close, I only meant this part. We're going to, of course, take questions from Angela. Will be reading your questions next. But before we get to that, Adrian.
It's such a good question, and there's so many responses. Can I just respond by giving like a 30-second anecdote about my favorite interview ever?
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
And I've gotten to interview like loads of interesting people over my life, politicians, athletes, celebrities, all that sort of stuff. But I remember this was, I was interning at the Toronto Star in the radio room. So I was in the box, and it was like 11:30 at night on like a Saturday or a Sunday. So like no one else was like in the newsroom at that time.
Also a Box alumni. Adrian.
Oh yeah. Woo!
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
We should just clarify for our audience, it's not, it's not an Amazon cardboard box with a return.
No, it's not.
It had a glass window.
Yeah.
Out to the newsroom, not outside.
So the phone rang, and this was around the time, I don't know if you remember this story. It was just like a little story that kind of went a bit viral, actually. And this was just like the kind of beginning of social media and Facebook and everything. But there was a young man who was a person of color, and he had tried to apply for a job at Queen's Park, and his email got CC'd back to him accidentally, and the person that was like taking the emails for the job interviews made like a pretty racist remark. And he got back to it and he said, oh my gosh, this is, awful. Like I've been kind of denied this sort of thing. Anyways, the Queen's Park employee that was responsible for that was named in the paper, and she was a Chinese Canadian. And so this story, got a lot of play for sure. I mean, really, really interesting. But I remember getting a phone call at 11:30 at night from the mother of another woman who shared the exact same name, in absolute tears, trying to explain to me that her daughter was being bullied over Facebook, getting death threats, getting all sorts of violent threats, and just because they had the same name. And she was trying to explain to me, because her English wasn't, she wasn't like a native English speaker. So my parents would have been proud of me. I busted out my pretty, mediocre Cantonese to talk to her. And I did. I got her to calm down. Like I got all the details from her. I ended up being able to write down enough of like a half a story, and then I handed it off to Nicholas Kung, who did a story on the whole thing about this, woman who's getting a kind of early example of bullying over Facebook. And I just say this because I remember in that moment, all the interviews I've done since then, like this is what's memorable to me, because I felt like in that moment, I was the only person in the world that could have really talked to this woman and got her story, right? Like it was just that, that sort of, that kismet, she was this, distraught woman whose family's from Hong Kong, my family's from Hong Kong, and what are the odds that she's able to connect with me just answering phone calls for the radio room? And I end up having this half an hour chat with her, and so it just reminds me of the privilege that we do have. Like a good interview to me is when I feel like I am the only person in the world that could have done your story justice, and I am grateful that you entrusted that to me, and I did my best to be prepared, and I was ready for that moment, and I listened to you, I took you seriously. That felt amazing. And I just I've interviewed way more like kind of famous and important people since then, but that's always stuck with me as the moment that I knew I just did a little bit of good, and that's that's
you were human. You were human.
Yeah.
Which is what we're talking about today. Really, yeah. So humanity. So Ange, I like to see if we have any questions about questions and the interviewing process from our audience.
Yeah, I do want to remind attendees that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions at this point. The first question is from Lisa, and Lisa asks, psychologists say that for something to be aggressive, it involves the intent to harm. Is asking challenging questions or having an unflinching interview style the same as being aggressive? Where is the line drawn?
Great question. Okay, then who would like to start? Who would like to?
Thanks for the question, Lisa. I think that's really interesting and a really good question. I think maybe sometimes we confuse aggressiveness with assertiveness. We mentioned this briefly earlier on during the discussion. Interviewing, there are so many interview techniques and strategies that we may not necessarily learn in journalism school. It really comes through experience, and it's really hard to train journalists on interviewing styles. You write your story, you send it into your professor, that gets graded, you get a lot of feedback, but there isn't anybody really grading you and giving you feedback when you're actually interviewing a source on the phone or in person. And there's just so much you have to learn by feeling over time. And then, I think, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but there's such a difference between asking, say, talking to a politician who owes the public answers, who should be around to answer questions from journalists. And you know, that may be an example of a time when you should be asking those hard and unflinching questions. And I think there are times when our interview style needs to be a little softer, you know, especially as we've been talking with when we're interviewing trauma survivors, or when and you know, if you'll allow me to use the word trauma a little more loosely as well, there's so many contexts where people bring in life trauma and, you know, experiences of poverty and income disparity and racial differences. All of these bring in so many sensitivities that we need to be aware of, need to research beforehand, so that we know how to frame our questions. They don't have to be, you know, the sort of direct Mike Wallace style questions, but if I can give an example, let's say if somebody says, you know, when Trump got elected, there were a lot of people saying, oh, I now feel safe being able to say Merry Christmas now that Trump's elected. And do we want to glom on to the fact that this is now somehow tied to Trump? Do we want to make him the sort of, you know, the darkness to pour all the emotion and toxicity into? Or do we want to explore the idea of safeness and ask the source, well, what is it in this situation that makes you safe? And understanding that perspective, I think, is key to really getting to nuances in a story. So I don't know if that necessarily answers it, but I think there's a time and place for asking hard and flinching questions. Yeah,
nuancing context is a way to defeat aggression, I suppose. Shenaz?
Yeah, no. I hear you. I think it's very different. Like, I mean, a journalistic interview is purpose driven, right? The reporter is there for a reason. And so it would be wrong, I think, to misconstrue that as them being deliberately aggressive unless they happen to be doing that. I think Fox News, you know, but by and large, no. I mean, and especially if journalists take the time to explain what they're doing in advance and really getting that informed consent that we've already talked about, it shouldn't really come across, the line of questioning shouldn't really be coming across as aggressive. Even when you're interviewing politicians and people and you're holding them to account, right, for their actions or inaction, it should always come across as professional and courteous and assertive, but not aggressive.
Adrian, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree with so much of that. And, you know, just as a person who has the privilege of teaching, you know, journalism to journalism students, I don't tell people to shy away from asking sensitive questions, but, you know, take the proper duty of care. And again, that duty of care and that approach, I think that does differ depending on who has power in that experience, you know. So yeah, I don't think sensitive questions need to be asked in a way that is aggressive either. There are multiple ways to approach asking a question. There are multiple ways to be persistent. You can be gently persistent, or, you know, more kind of active in that respect. So yeah, I think nuance and context matters so much with that. And
just to pick up on what you said, I think it is as simple as the way that questions are framed, that asking an open-ended questions that demonstrate you are listening and trying to understand, rather than making the assumptions and loading them up. Did you murder your wife? Instead of trying to understand, you know. So, you know, what was happening that led to this? What were you thinking? What were you thinking? Can you describe, you know, how such and such came up? Can you describe? Demonstrates that you're willing to invest in the person and to really understand, even if you, in Shenaz, I think that's what you were talking about with your story earlier, you know, even if you may really disagree or even abhor the views of someone that you're interviewing. That is that is really challenging. But if you are assigned to do that, or you've chosen to do that because it's a good story, it is coming to kind of understand on behalf of your audience as much as possible about what they are thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And, if I can add to that, I wouldn't want any of this to be misconstrued as being shy, shying away from asking certain questions. I think the worst thing we can do as journalists is not ask our questions. What we want to be mindful of is how we're framing our questions and who are we asking those questions to. It's also important.
Mm-hmm. Are there, before I go back to Andrea, I'm curious, are there situations where you would feel that you wanted to do an interview with someone, but you don't believe that they are as informed about consent, or if there are other circumstances that you just believe you shouldn't do an interview with them? And would you make that decision?
I think if they're under the influence of something, I think if if something has just immediately happened and it puts them into a state where emotionally they may do or say things it's really not in their character. It's not that I wouldn't ignore it, but I would just kind of factor this into my interactions with them. I think for starters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess, your question reminds me of when I interviewed Kevin Johnston, who's a right-wing activist, who's well known for he's a known bigot, racial bigot, and has perpetuated a lot of stereotypes and inaccurate lies, really, about racialized people, especially Muslims, throughout the GTA. And so, when I interviewed him, that was also like a difficult scenario for me too, because at the time I was freelancing for Al Jazeera, doing an article for them, and I regretted doing the interview with him immediately after, because the respect that I give to all my sources is a given, right? No matter whether I agree with their position or not. And I afforded him that same respect, and I didn't receive it in return, because he recorded our interview without consent, and he put it on his public website for all his followers to see. And then he doxed me after that. And so that experience gave me pause, as to whether I want to include that side of the story when I'm writing about stories related to or that involve sources that are on the extreme right, like he is.
All right, thank you. And another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Andrew. And Andrew says, Shenaz talked about the distrust of Western media that exists legitimately in many parts of the world. But there also is mistrust of the media that is being promoted as by Trumpians in the US, and as we have seen by the leaders of the truckers convoy in Canada, as part of an effort to undermine journalism that challenges their misinformation and untruths. Can we afford to abandon the tough-minded Mike Wallace approach without abandoning journalism's public mission?
Great question, Andrew. And to Adrian?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure those are mutually exclusive, right? Like, I don't think that this is anything. There's nothing about here that's about abandoning asking difficult or tough questions. It's really about, having a sense of care for people that are in vulnerable positions, and I think kind of being a bit more mindful to that.
Shenaz?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when I brought up that example, I mean, disinformation is rife, of course, in amongst media right here, and I think it's it's often interpreted as being fake news. And I'm talking about outlets like the Toronto Star, the National Post, the Globe and Mail. You know, like these are mainstream news outlets that we look to that are widely respected amongst some people and not by others, right? But we have to make the distinction between outlets that do purposely, intentionally are malicious in perpetuating inaccurate information, and these news outlets, you know, which do subscribe to to proper journalistic standards, right, and principles. So I think it's important to not kind of fall, to not kind of get roped into thinking that, you know, these outlets, like however problematic mainstream news outlets can be in their framing and approach, it wouldn't really be fair to put them in the same category as outlets like Rebel Media and Fox News who do it maliciously, you know, and with intent.
Yeah, I think it's not a question of abandoning, perhaps, you know, letting go of perhaps that style of interview. But it's not, you're not abandoning the questions that you have on your mind. You still want to ask those questions, and you should be asking those questions. The problem with how divisive our world is right now is that I think as I said in the beginning, I fear that a Mike Wallace approach is going to have people shut down, and then you don't have sources talking to you. So how are you going to frame the question so that they can once again regain, maybe not trust in every single journalist in all newsrooms out there, but how can they trust you in your interviewing style? So I think that's important to keep in mind. And you know, when we are challenging leaders of the truckers' convoy or Trumpians or Congress members and politicians who have who may have perhaps racist views or sexist views, you know, how much of a platform do we want to give them? What kind of a platform do we want to give them? And it's not a matter of, you know, this can be applied to climate change as well. It's not a matter of this side of the story versus that side of the story. That's simplicity. And I think what we should be doing as journalists is complicating that narrative. Where's the complexity in this? So, you know, here are very divergent views. As I said it before, where's the nuance and where's the complexity? So it's not at all about abandoning the quest for the answers that we seek.
Perhaps the difference, you know, early on, you know, with the truckers, the difference between saying, "Did you come here to create mayhem?" as a journalistic question versus, "What were you expecting, you know, this to accomplish? What can you describe to me what you were hoping this was going to lead to?"
Mm-hmm.
See, I can't even quite work up the aggression in my voice when I ask it the second way. It's not aggressive, but it's an attempt. It's demonstrating at least an attempt in trying to understand what is going on. And to me, you know, that is no less effective for people that you are trying to hold to account than others. All right.
Okay, Janice. Yeah, that's such a great example. The first one was very, confrontational, and the second style of questioning demonstrates curiosity, and I think more likely to elicit an honest answer rather than a reactionary knee-jerk statement.
Mm-hmm. Well, and hopefully answers that haven't been, hopefully an answer where you can kind of actually hear somebody thinking as opposed to giving an answer because they've been asked that question 20 times already.
Exactly.
Media trained or not, that's something else. Anyway, all right, thank you. Andrew, next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Aloysius. And Aloysius asks, says, you've mentioned that emotional moments in an interview, at least ideally, should be earned. How do you know that you've earned the right to ask a grieving mother about her child or a survivor about their deepest trauma? If you feel uncertain, do you ask anyway for the story? When do you personally refrain from asking a sensitive question?
If I can just answer with a total cop-out, I'm not sure you ever truly No, I mean, in a sense, right? Like, you can get informed consent. You can make the source as comfortable as possible, but do you know if you've actually done harm to this person? They might not even know until they finish the interview and giving you the response. So I think you do your best. You do your best to be, a empathetic human. You do your best to offer a high standard of care for a source if they're especially of that kind of vulnerable position. But I think a part of you is always going to wonder a little bit, like, should I have asked that question? Did they even understand themselves, like how hurt or how difficult that was going to be? To be honest, man, I'm never really sure that for sure 100%. And a lot of it comes down to like experience and making the effort to do so. And this is part of the job. Like we're human beings talking to other human beings, and things get difficult and messy.
Yeah, and remember that there is a lot of value in sharing stories of trauma, right? They make other people feel so much less alone. So those are things that I like to remind my sources when they express hesitancy. I've never pushed anyone to share their story when they don't want to. But what I have heard from them is that they feel like it's a little bit healing to talk about it, I know that there's a risk in adding to their trauma with the questions that we ask, but the best way to really know whether they're okay with it is to just be upfront and ask them, and then believe them when they give their consent. When I interviewed a Hazara woman from Afghanistan, she lives here in Canada, for the Globe and Mail in the summer after the US withdrawal, she told me stories that were horrifying about her experiences, growing up there and being oppressed by and silenced in so many different ways by the Taliban. And we spoke for hours in a park. Our children were in front of us. She had to stop many times to just kind of pause and recover and kind of gather herself together. And I gave her that time. I told her, there's no rush. When we don't even have to do it all today. We can schedule another time to talk, and she said, no, like, let's do this. I want to do this. It's important that people know what we go through. And I have ways. She told me that, that I have concrete, like, not solutions, but like, I have ideas that I want to work on to help other people who are that have gone through this experience too. And I think talking to you is helping me, just relate those experiences to people. So let's do it.
Yeah, hi Aloysius, was my student in JRN 344 last semester. I always operate on the assumption that nobody owes me their stories. But I am in a position of privilege, I'm in a position of power. And that assumption never really changes, throughout the course of reporting and researching and interviewing. I'm always of the belief, this story, I never earned it. But the question for me to ask is, do people trust me enough to handle their story responsibly? So I think that's perhaps another way to look at it, rather than wondering if we have actually earned the right in any sort of way to receive and tell their story. I don't know that we ever do.
If I could just maybe add just a quick follow-up, actually literally about following up, and I think that's one practical tip you can apply, which is, if during the process of your interview you can check in with them, and after publication, when the story's out there, I would always check in with them too, especially if it's a really difficult experience for them. And that's when they can be honest with you and say, oh, that was a lot harder than I thought, but I'm glad I did it. Or you might get, I'm really uncomfortable with that. I kind of regret that. Either way, though, you'll learn. And I think just by opening up and making an effort to reach out again to that source after you've shared this experience, that's the way to build trust, and it's a way to navigate that, I think.
I'm going to toss in something here, an answer to this. Barbara Frum, who done almost 30 years ago. She was host of As It Happens and other programs at CBC. She gave an interview to someone writing about interviewing, and she talked about the question called "How do you feel?" And because essentially we've talked about being human, that is what we want to know from people. And I think on behalf of our audiences and our readers, we want to know what it felt like for them to go through X experience. But often the question is asked, far too early, far too glibly in interviews. And this is what Barbara Frum said about this, because she said, asking, how do you feel? It's too simple and contains too much. It asks for too much revelation in too boring and an unresourceful way. The interviewer has to earn the answer. You have to deserve a good answer because you've put a lot of thought into the subject because you care about the person. You usually get what you deserve with a question like that, which is lather. And I love that quote, because she's describing
She a legend.
situations where that is not. She is a legend. Yes, she was. Yeah. So I hope that helps answer the question as well. Ange, are there more questions?
Yeah, the next question is from Mara. Mara says, journalists are the public's eyes and ears, which imposes a real responsibility to the public and the public interest, a responsibility to bring important stories to light and to work hard to make sure they are as accurate and as informed as possible. That often requires asking difficult questions that may be troubling to your sources. How do you balance your public responsibility to tell the story with your concern for your sources when that concern could undermine the integrity of your story?
All right, who'd like to jump in?
I just wanted to clarify something in the question. When you say, how do you determine, if you can read the last part again, how do you determine the
how do you balance your public responsibility to tell the story with your concern for your sources when that concern could undermine the integrity of your story?
So when you say when it concerns, if you're concerned about how it might compromise the integrity of your story, are you referring to the whole idea of neutrality again, and how to balance that with a line of questioning that is empathetic?
Well, let's make that assumption, because the questioner can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I need to think about that. But yeah, Adrian and Vidya, what do you think?
Question, and as a sort of additional question to that, does showing empathy and care to your source in trauma-informed reporting undermine the story that we ultimately write as journalists? And I'm not sure that I see that. We still have power as journalists. We are the ones telling the story, and we have a responsibility to fact check what our sources are telling us. Most people, I think, come with the intent to share their story for what they believe is a greater good. And we still have the responsibility to then take that information you've given us and ensure that that's accurate. Where else can we go fact check that information? Is it possible to fact check it elsewhere? Are there other sources we can collaborate that with? Is it a shared experience? What is the bigger picture? And ultimately, there are so many individuals with so many different kinds of traumas. And the purpose of journalism is maybe not necessarily to tell each individual's story, but to tell why that story matters. So I think if we keep that perspective in mind, that's how we can guard against sources, say, trying to manipulate our work. And that certainly happens. I've had plenty of sources who try to tell me how to write my story, what I should write in and what words I should write, and ask to see the story before publication. sources will certainly try to get a hand in the stories involved, especially if they have public relations firms working for them. They will try to control the narrative. And I think we really, really have to be careful with fact checking in those instances and know and really be able to recognize why certain statements that we may want to make are facts. And that's ultimately what we really want to stick to, is the hard facts.
All right. Thank you, Vidya. And is there time for one more question, or are you throwing?
I think we can do one more. So the next one, attendee asked, can you talk a bit about variations in the interviewer's role? In interviews for text stories, the verbatim questions normally aren't shared, questions and the answers, but in those where the questions are part of a live show like W5, the whole journalistic approach may be different. How does this change your approach to asking difficult questions?
Anyone want to jump in?
I think maybe I should let the broadcast journalists really take this.
I mean, sorry, Janice, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask viewers to know.
Well, I would say, okay, Adrian, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just taking a breath, but honestly, I'm not necessarily sure how much it would change my approach, because I think so much of my approach is really done before the interview happens. Like, it's really about doing my background research, like making very clear expectations with the source about, what the story is about, like where it's going to appear, like how their interview, is going to be used. The line of questioning that I have, I think I always do my best to be, to talk about what is necessary, what is in the public interest. But I think actually a lot of this work is kind of done like before the interview actually happens, and then it's about the kind of care afterwards. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I was just going to jump in to say the examples given, even W5, are not live interviews. So there are a lot of interviews that not a lot of podcasts, well, virtually every podcast that is kind of presented as a live conversation, but they are edited. So the journalist takes power back from, if the interview subject has had it, and exercises that. So there is, there are live broadcasts, and that's, they are clearly identified. But there's also, in broadcasting, there's a huge murky middle where it's presented as live, but it's not necessarily. It has been edited for clarity, for length, or for other, other reasons.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually going to express the same sentiment, that I feel like the distinctions in variations for interviewing would lie more in those that are done for broadcast versus online, because of the editing factor that comes into play. So yeah, it plays out very differently in that scenario.
And I'm going to jump in. We are to the end of our time here today. So I want to thank you all, and I'm going to ask Jim to come back and say goodbye.
Well, I want to thank the panel and our moderator for a very stimulating and engaging discussion. So thank you to all of you. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today as well. Our next event is going to be next Thursday, a week from today, Thursday, February 24th at 4 p.m. It's going to be a very different one. It's the launch of a new CFE series entitled Why Whistleblowers Matter. And the series is going to involve interviews with a number of really prominent and important Canadian whistleblowers, because not only are journalists the public's eyes and ears, but whistleblowers often bring matters to public attention that otherwise would be buried or unreported. Our first in the series is with Dr. Michelle Brill Edwards, who is a physician who was a senior physician in the health protection branch at Health Canada, and had to speak up because there was no remedy internally about a very important issue that called into question the whole integrity of Health Canada's approval of pharmaceutical drugs. So I hope you'll join us next week, next Thursday at 4 p.m. And information about that is available on a CFE website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca, as well as a video of today's conversation will be posted on our website tomorrow and on our YouTube channel. So if you have any colleagues or friends who you'd like to recommend watch it, encourage them to go there and see what you've enjoyed this afternoon. Thank you very much to all of you, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Ange.
Thank you.